Chapter 1. The Smell of BBQ and Mockery. It had been a long flight home from Nevada, and as I turned onto my parents' street in Asheville, the familiar sound of laughter drifted down the block. It was the 4th of July, and the Mitchells never did small gatherings. Every year, half the neighborhood showed up for food, fireworks, and the same stories passed around like old, comfortable jokes. The smell of grilled burgers and sweet corn filled the air, and for a moment, I almost forgot why my stomach was tight. Then I heard my cousin's voice. Jake Cole, 35 years old, built like a fitness commercial, always surrounded by people. I could pick his tone out of any crowd. I stepped through the side gate, into the backyard, still wearing jeans and a t-shirt from the base exchange, trying to blend in like I hadn't just spent months flying combat simulations. Heads turned when I walked in. My mother waved from the table, covered in potato salad and coleslaw, her voice too bright. "Lauren's home. Look who finally made it back." My father, Richard, stood at the grill, tongs in one hand and a beer in the other. His smile was small, cautious. Jake leaned against the cooler, surrounded by a group of younger cousins who treated him like a minor celebrity. He grinned when he saw me, that kind of grin that already knew it was about to land a punch. "Look who's here, the Valkyrie herself." "What's next, Lauren? Planning to land that plane in my yard this time?" The laughter came right on cue, the polite kind that fills the air when people don't know whether to join in or stay quiet. I forced a smile, the same one I'd perfected for debriefings and press inquiries. I heard the word Valkyrie and felt that old flicker in my chest, the mix of pride and weariness that came from knowing a nickname could carry both respect and rumor. My father flipped a burger. My mother called out that someone should grab more ice. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut through the laughter, but years of military training had taught me restraint. You don't engage unless you have to. You keep your bearing. Ethan Cole, Jake's father, and my uncle stood by the fence, a paper plate balanced in one hand. Retired Navy SEAL commander. Quiet authority. The kind of man who could silence a room just by standing up. His eyes met mine for a moment, steady, unreadable. Then he looked away. I took a beer from the cooler, cracked it open, and nodded at Jake. "How's business?" I asked. "The gym treating you well?" He smirked. "Business is good. Real work, you know. Helping people transform?" He gestured toward his arms. "The kind of results you can see." His tone wasn't outright hostile, just smug enough to sting. I took a sip of beer and said nothing. Around us, the music played low, some country song about small towns and loyalty. Kids ran through sprinklers, their laughter mixing with the sound of sizzling meat. Normal life. The kind of life I used to think I'd come home to easily. Marianne, my mother, appeared beside me with that fixed smile she always wore when tension was brewing. "Why don't you two catch up?" she said, her voice light. "Lauren, tell Jake about your training." "Jake, show her those pictures from your last event." Her hands fluttered in the air, like she could will peace into existence. I glanced at her, then at my father. He didn't intervene, just poked at the burgers like they needed his full attention. Family dynamics are their own battlefield, and we'd all chosen our roles long ago. Jake opened a new beer. "So, Lauren, how's the Air Force treating you these days? Still doing that flight school thing?" I could feel eyes on me, everyone waiting for how I'd respond. "Still flying," I said. "It's been busy." He chuckled. "Busy? Must be hard, sitting behind all those computers." I almost laughed. The joke was lazy, but it still hit. He didn't know what busy meant. Busy was flying 12-hour combat support rotations, eating from ration packs, sleeping 2 hours at a time while a crew chief patched bullet holes in your aircraft. Busy was watching tracer rounds light up a night sky and knowing the people you were covering might not live till morning. But explaining that to Jake would be like describing the ocean to someone who'd never left the desert. "Yeah, Busy, I said instead, keeping my tone light. Someone has to make sure the real heroes get home safe. My father's tongs paused midair. Ethan's gaze flicked toward me. The faintest sign of interest. Jake raised an eyebrow, smirked again, and turned away to grab another drink. The moment passed, but the air felt different. As the sun dropped lower, the yard filled with golden light. My mother set out pie. Someone started passing around sparklers for the kids. I found myself by the fence next to Ethan. He didn't look at me at first, just took a slow drink of his beer. Heard training's been tough out west, he said finally. It has, I replied. Good kind of tough. He nodded, eyes still on the horizon. Your call sign still Valkyrie? I hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. He exhaled, slow. Good name, he said. Means you don't quit. That's what they said when they gave it to me. You earned it, Lauren. Don't let a few careless people make you forget that. For a moment, I thought he was going to say more, but he didn't. He just tipped his beer toward me slightly and walked off toward the grill. It was the kind of gesture that meant more than words. Later, as fireworks began popping over the neighborhood, I sat on the back steps with my mother. She handed me a plate of pie, her eyes soft. He doesn't mean anything by it, she said. Jake, I mean. He just talks before he thinks. I know, I said quietly, but it doesn't make it right. She nodded, looking out at the bursts of color lighting up the sky. He's insecure. Always has been. Your uncle's shadow was big to grow up under. I looked toward Ethan, who was standing near the fire pit now, talking with my father. I understood. Military families carry legacies like weight on their shoulders, but understanding didn't erase the sting. After a while, people started to leave. Cars pulled out of the driveway, kids half asleep in the back seats. The house quieted down to the familiar rhythm of crickets and the last hiss of the dying coals. I helped my father clean up. He didn't say much, just passed me a stack of plates and gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. That was his way of saying he'd seen what happened, that he was proud of how I'd handled it. When the yard was finally empty, I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where Jake had been holding court earlier. I could still hear the echo of his laughter, still feel the heat of my own restraint. Years in uniform had taught me how to keep my cool under pressure, but nothing in combat ever felt as personal as that moment when your own family doubted you. I finished the last of my beer and tossed the bottle into the bin. The glass clinked softly, the sound oddly final. Inside, my mother was loading the dishwasher, humming to herself like everything was normal again. My father turned off the porch light. As I headed upstairs to the guest room, I passed the hallway mirror. For a second, I didn't see the daughter or the cousin. I saw the officer, the one who'd flown through desert firestorms, who'd led her squadron through missions that would never make the news, the one who'd earned every scar, every ounce of respect, the hard way. But standing there in my parents' quiet house, I also saw the fracture line forming deep inside, that silent crack between who I was out there and who they still thought I was here. Outside, another firework went off in the distance, the echo fading over the Blue Ridge Hills. I turned away from the mirror, switched off the hall light, and let the house fall back into silence. Tonight had reminded me of something I hadn't wanted to face. War zones were easier than family dinners. At least in combat, you always knew who your allies were. Chapter 2. A buried secret morning light slipped through the blinds, and I woke to the smell of coffee and cut grass, the familiar soundtrack of my parents' house in summer. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet, letting my pulse slow until the echo of last night faded. The backyard was empty now, only damp ring marks on the patio where coolers had sat, and a few spent sparklers in the flower bed. I dressed in running shoes and an old academy shirt, stepped outside, and started down the street. The air in Asheville at that hour felt clean, like a reset. Feet found their rhythm, breath settled, and the white noise in my head thinned enough that an older noise could slip back in. Rotor wash somewhere far away. Radio calls layered over engine hum. The canyon in Afghanistan, Kandahar in 2015, was beige on beige until the sun went down and the world turned silver and black. I was a captain then, more hours in the simulator than in the jet, hungry to make the math of flight match the chaos of the ground. The brief said a reconnaissance team had eyes on a target and a clean exit. Then it did what briefs sometimes do when the world ignores them. The team moved. The hills woke up. The corridor that had been quiet on satellite images, lit with tracers, and a single word from the ground net set my teeth on edge. Pinned. Fuel numbers were not my friend that night. I remember the way the digits glowed on the panel, and how my thumb hovered over the switch that would have sent me back to base on schedule. I remember Captain Drew Lawson in my ear, steady, telling me we could stretch but not by much. I remember the thermal image of bodies low to the earth, and the pulse of muzzle flashes above them, and the feeling in my ribs when I accepted the trade I was about to make. Time for risk, fuel for lives. There is a point in low-altitude flight when the jet is not just machine and pilot, but impulse and muscle memory. The ridge lines rose up like teeth. I dropped to the number I had promised myself I would not cross, and then went lower anyway. I felt the rounds before I heard them, a dull vibration through the frame, tiny percussions like hail. Training makes your world small on purpose. Sight picture, range, angle, wind. The rest becomes a background roar. I worked through the belt, reset, worked again, turned the path ahead of the team into something a helicopter could trust. The second bird came in clean, lift dust, a flash of shapes, the briefest pause as weight met rotor and then rose. I climbed out slow, coaxing a little more forgiveness from the gauges, and did not realize I had been holding my breath until I heard the green light tone that meant I would make it home. On the ground, the crew chief pointed to the holes along a panel and gave me the look maintainers reserve for pilots who pressed their luck. My commander did not raise his voice. He only said my name and nodded once. 2 days later, a call sign arrived with a laugh that tried and failed to hide relief. Valkyrie. The mission went into a file stamped and locked. Outside the hangar, life rolled forward. I learned to put the memory where I could reach it without letting it reach me first. I never told my family. I did not need to. The people who needed to know already knew. At least that was the idea. After my run, I found my parents at the kitchen table. My mother had the newspaper spread open, and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. My father had a manila envelope in his hands that did not belong to a holiday morning. He looked up at me, then down again. Lockridge Defense Systems was printed in tidy type in the corner. I asked if the mail had come early, and my mother said yes, in a tone that tried to sound casual and did not quite make it. My father slid a single page from the envelope and set it between us. The letter was formal, even in summary. A federal inquiry into potential unauthorized access of archived project data. A request for voluntary cooperation. A note that former employees with system permissions during a certain window would be contacted. A list of programs that included avionics packages I knew too well. My name was not on the letter. It did not have to be. My father cleared his throat and said they probably sent one to many people. He said that when you work in defense long enough, you get used to these things. He said that the dates were years ago and that his login had been disabled the day he retired. He said a lot of reasonable things and stared at the place on the table where the ink was darkest. I asked when it arrived. He said yesterday afternoon. He said he had not wanted to bring it up with company in the house. My mother touched the back of his hand, then turned to the sink and busied herself with dishes that were already clean. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Ethan Cole. We were not the kind of relatives who called one another on weekday mornings. I stepped onto the porch and answered. He did not waste time. He said there was chatter in places retired people still have access to. He said an investigation that had started narrow was expanding. He said a contractor name I already knew and a list of systems that lined up uncomfortably with the machines I flew. He said that when public stories begin to move, they pile unrelated facts until the stack looks like proof. He said my name was beginning to ride along. I told him I understood. He said he had already spoken to Richard. He said that if anyone asked, I should say nothing beyond the sentence we both knew by heart: I cannot discuss operational matters. He added a final line that did not sound like advice so much as regret. He said he wished he had spoken up sooner about what he knew of me. He said, silence protects the right things until it does not. I hung up and watched a lawn service truck rattle past the house, the driver tapping the steering wheel to a country song I could not hear. The neighborhood looked unchanged. Flags still fluttered on porches. A stray sparkler wire still glittered in the driveway. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the morning run. Inside, my father had folded the letter back into the envelope. He asked if I had heard from anyone at the base. I said no, not yet. He said good, and then he said he was sorry his name was crossing paths with mine in a way neither of us wanted. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He shook his head and said a father apologizes anyway when trouble comes to the door he once guarded. The rest of the day tried to pretend it was ordinary. My mother suggested a grocery trip. I offered to go. We walked the aisles while she pointed out peaches and asked about protein powder and tried to act like we were simply filling a cart. People stopped us to say hello. Someone asked if I was home for good now. I said no, just visiting. The cashier said her brother had joined the service and asked if I had any advice. I said to sleep when he could and to take care of his knees. Back at the house, my father had pulled files from a plastic bin in the garage, neat stacks of old pay stubs and exit paperwork, and security clearance documents with stamps that had faded to pale blue. He said he knew it would not matter in a narrative driven by appetite, but he wanted his side of the drawer in order anyway. I sat with him, and we made piles that meant something only to us, a career rearranged into paper that proved he had done it properly. My phone buzzed a second time that afternoon. The name on the screen was Drew Lawson. We had not traded much more than holiday texts in years. He said he had heard a rumor that a certain mission was back under a microscope, not for what happened in the canyon, but because journalists had learned enough acronyms to be dangerous. He said a reporter had reached him through a network contact and asked whether a female pilot had flown below doctrine on a night when fuel numbers were wrong. He said he had given no comment and would continue to give no comment. He said he thought I should know. I thanked him. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. We both recognized the lie and let it pass. He told me to keep my head down for a few days and to let the people with the right stationery handle it. He reminded me that what we did that night had been logged, reviewed, and approved long ago by people who understood the cost. I reminded him that cost is not what sells. He laughed without humor and told me to call if I needed anything. Evening pressed against the windows, and the day collapsed into the small rituals that keep families upright. My mother put on a pot of chili because that is what she makes when the weather cannot decide what it is doing. My father checked the porch light even though it always works. I took the trash out and stood at the curb a little longer than necessary, watching the sky go from blue to purple and thinking about how quickly a story can turn when it finds a tailwind. I thought about Ethan and the way his voice had paused before he said my name would be in the conversation. I thought about the men he had led and the empty chair he carries for all the ones he could not bring home, and how secrets can feel like service until they become shadows that follow the wrong people. I thought about the letter on our kitchen table and the fact that a seal in the corner can mean legitimacy or danger, depending on who waves it. After dinner, my mother pretended she needed something from the pantry and asked me to walk with her. In the quiet of the garage, she told me she hated the way people who did not know me were going to talk about me. She said she knew I could handle it, but that she did not want me to have to. I told her that I would be fine, that this is what I am trained for, not the words or the headlines, but the patience to outlast them. She nodded, wiped at her eye, and said that patience is easier to preach than to live. My father joined us and said Ethan had called again. He said Ethan had a contact who believed the inquiry was widening in part because unrelated data breaches in other places had put everyone on alert. He said that when systems panic, they grab wider circles. He said there would be more letters, more calls, more noise. He looked at me, tired and steady. He said that whatever happened, our job was the same as it had always been. Tell the truth we are allowed to tell, and keep faith with the rest. I went to my old room and sat on the edge of the bed that still had the same creak in the frame. The walls were bare, except for a photo of me on a runway taken years ago, the jet behind me like a shadow I had learned to wear. I thought about that night in the canyon and the unspoken ledger that lives inside anyone who has ever gambled with time. I thought about how easy it would be for strangers to pick up pieces of that ledger and arrange them into a picture that did not match the truth. My phone buzzed once more. A message from an unknown number that began with a polite greeting and a request to confirm a few facts for a story on women in combat aviation. I deleted it without responding and set the phone face down. Downstairs, I could hear my parents talking in the soft way married people talk when they are trying not to wake a house. The refrigerator clicked on. A car door closed somewhere on the street. Ordinary sounds. Then a sure memory rose, not of the canyon or the jet, but of a briefing room the week after that mission. The commander had written a sentence on a whiteboard and capped his marker with care. Protect what matters. Do not feed what does not. I turned off the lamp and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The day felt like a held breath, somewhere between the last calm second and the first gust of wind. The air changes. You do not need a weather report to feel it. I did not know exactly when the storm would break, only that it was already on the way. Chapter 3. Public Outrage and Family Shadows. By Tuesday, the first push alert hit my phone while I was running errands with my mother. New reporting questioned my judgment in the cockpit and implied I had mishandled sensitive systems. By the time we reached the checkout, the headline was already on the local news loop above the register, my picture cropped tight like a mugshot. I felt the familiar narrowing that happens before a hard turn. Breathe. Choose. Act. I paid for groceries and walked my mother to the car. At home, I opened the article and read every line twice. It stacked publicly available facts in a way that suggested a single story. An A-10 pilot with a high-profile call sign, an old defense program with archived data, a retired engineer father who had once had access, anonymous sources who were experts by virtue of using the right acronyms. There were no outright lies, only gravity applied at the most convenient angles. An email sat in my inbox from Rachel Newen. The subject line was polite. The body offered me a chance to provide context. She referenced the canyon, my squadron, my service record, the investigation into Lockridge Defense Systems. She asked if I wished to comment on allegations of procedural lapses and whether my call sign was connected to the incident under review. I stared at the blinking cursor, then typed a single sentence that I had lived with for years. I wrote that I could not discuss national security matters. I hit send and closed the laptop. By evening, the story had been aggregated into something louder. The comments sections roared with strangers who were convinced they knew me. Reckless, some said. Product of a public relations machine, others added. A handful called me a token. My mother tried to keep scrolling as if context might reveal a kinder angle. She lasted 4 minutes before the tears came fast and hot. My father reached over and turned off the television. He said I could not stay silent forever. He said there were times when you had to speak to the room you did not respect because someone you loved was sitting in it. I told him my room was a very specific one, with rules that did not bend for feelings. He nodded without agreeing and went to the porch to breathe. The next morning, my phone lit with messages from numbers I did not recognize. A podcast producer wanted an interview. A blogger requested a quote. A former classmate from the academy offered thoughts that were mostly an opportunity to attach his name to mine. I set the phone face down and made coffee. The steam rose and dispersed like a briefing fog. I reminded myself of the boundaries that keep you sane. Protect what matters. Do not feed what does not. Jake called before noon. He sounded energized, like someone who had found wind in his sails. He said he was launching a program called SEAL Fit Challenge, a premium training experience built around discipline, mindset, and legacy. He said sponsors were interested and that a local news station wanted to feature him as a voice on resilience. I did not ask how a gym trainer had become a voice on resilience. He did not ask how it felt to watch my name get dragged through a conversation he intended to monetize. He mentioned a logo, then laughed and said he had found an edgy graphic with a winged helmet that looked familiar. He said people loved a symbol. I pictured the patch on my flight bag and said nothing. He took my silence as envy and told me I should come to a demo day and see what real motivation looked like. The call ended when he got another notification. The line clicked, and I stood in my parents' kitchen with the kettle whistling and the peculiar sensation that a family can pull in two directions at once without noticing the seam. That afternoon, Ethan stopped by. He carried the kind of presence that made neighbors straighten without knowing why. He sat at our table and poured coffee he did not drink. He said he had seen the site Jake had built overnight and the promotional video with clips of waves and rucks and a slow pan across a helmet that resembled mine too closely to be accidental. He said he had told his son to take it down. He said Jake had told him that a name was a tool and that he had spent a lifetime proving that very point. He said he had never felt older than he did listening to that. I asked Ethan what he wanted from me. He said he wanted me to do nothing that would cost me more than it bought. He said he would handle his son. He said he was sorry that silence had bent into something that could be mistaken for indifference. He rubbed his forehead like the years were heavy, and then he left, the screen door closing softly behind him. By midweek, the online backlash had calcified into something like consensus. Strangers debated whether I was reckless or coddled. Some said both, which was almost funny. The story jumped from local to national for one cycle, then settled into the algorithmic churn that keeps outrage afloat. I went for runs. I cleaned my parents' garage. I took my mother to pick up a prescription and sat in the car while she spoke to a pharmacist who knew our family well enough to offer a discount without naming the reason. Inside the house that evening, I found my mother at the table again, laptop open, face tight. She had clicked on a video Jake posted. He stood in front of an American flag at a borrowed training field, shirt tight, voice smooth. He talked about discipline and sacrifice. He invoked his father. He invoked the word legacy. He did not mention that legacy is a thing earned with time and pain. At the end of the clip, the camera cut to a black and white graphic of a winged figure and block letters spelling the new brand. It was not my call sign, but it was close enough to make my teeth meet hard. My mother said it felt like theft, then apologized for saying something impolite about her nephew. I told her truth and politeness rarely sit at the same table. My father came in from the porch, set his keys down, and said he had called Ethan. He said he had used the tone old friends use when the next words will hurt, and that he had told Ethan he would pull the family out of any public event that used that logo. He said he did not care how awkward Thanksgiving would be. Another message came from Rachel that night. She said she understood why I had declined comment and that she would keep her note respectful. She said she still wanted to hear my side for context. I typed and deleted a reply. Finally, I wrote that my side was a matter of record in places that did not accept anonymous sources. I wished her luck and closed my laptop again. Thursday morning, a neighbor named Frank knocked with a casserole because that is how Southern people tell you they are on your side when they do not know what to say. He stood on the porch, shifting from foot to foot, and said he had read a few things, but that they did not sound like the Lauren he knew. I thanked him and meant it. After he left, I carried the dish to the kitchen and set it next to the coffee maker. My mother covered it with foil, as if warmth could be stored for later. The storm found a new edge that afternoon, when a morning show pulled a few photos of me in uniform from public pages and paired them with stock footage of jets. The anchor used my name with that slight lift that suggests scandal. The segment producer had called for comment and received my standard sentence, then booked a panel without me. A retired officer, who did not know me, spoke in generalities about the pressures of modern operations. A talking head with no military background nodded at all the wrong times. After 3 minutes, my father turned off the television again and said he did not know how anyone could watch this and learn anything. I called the base legal office and left a message that I was available if the inquiry needed a statement. I texted my commander a brief update and added that I would be reachable at my parents' house. He replied that I was to speak to no one and to keep my head down because the board would not try this in the press. He added that my record spoke for itself and that we were not going to let a sloppy narrative become a fact. I read his words twice, with the kind of gratitude that sits behind your ribs, where stubbornness usually lives. That evening, my father and I drove to Ethan's house. The sky had that bruised color it gets over the Blue Ridge right before rain. We found Ethan in the garage with a row of old rucksacks on a shelf and a workbench covered in neat piles. Jake's truck was in the driveway. We could hear voices inside, and something in the cadence told me the conversation had been going for a while. Ethan opened the door and looked tired. He said Jake was upstairs, cooling off. He said he had told his son that using my symbol was out of bounds, and that invoking his service for profit shamed the very thing he claimed to honor. He said Jake had thrown back a line about building a life on a name, and that if his father could, so could he. Ethan said he had never wanted to hit his son until he heard that sentence come out of his mouth. He did not. He said he would never. He said he asked Jake to pack up the cameras and to call his sponsors and to tell them he had chosen integrity over marketing. He said he told him that if the sponsors left, then they were not worth keeping. We sat in the garage on folding chairs while the rain started, tapping the driveway with the steady insistence of time passing. Ethan asked me how long I thought this would last. I said storms in the press usually burned hot and fast, unless there was fuel. He said fuel was everywhere these days. I said I knew. Jake came down with a careful face and sat on the stairs like a teenager, catching breath after a fight. He did not look at me. He said he had taken the site offline. He said he would replace the logo with something generic. He said he would issue a line about respecting service and sticking to his lane. He did not apologize. I did not ask him to. Back at my parents' house, we ate Frank's casserole and listened to the rain through the kitchen window. My mother said she might take a break from the internet for a while. My father said that sounded like wisdom. I said nothing and took another bite even though I was not hungry. Before I went to bed, I opened my email one more time. There was a message from a government address I recognized. It was not accusatory. It was procedural. It asked for availability during the next 2 weeks for a formal interview related to a review of archived operational decisions and chain of command documentation. It asked for a phone call to schedule. It thanked me for my service with the kind of sincerity that often reads as template. I closed the message and turned out the light. In the dark, I could hear the rain easing to a soft patter. The house settled around me, familiar and protective, like layers of canvas against a draft. The anger of strangers was still loud out there somewhere, but within these walls the only sounds were ordinary. a pipe ticking, a car easing past, my mother's soft footsteps in the hall. I let my mind empty until the images of the canyon receded and the shape of the next step took their place. I would answer what I could answer. I would keep faith with what I could not. In the morning, I would call the number in the message and set a time. Chapter 4. The Investigation. The call connected on the second ring, and a calm scheduler voice offered 2 dates. I chose the earliest. By afternoon, my travel orders arrived with an address on Independence Avenue and a report time in the morning. I packed my uniform with the same care I had used since my first check ride. Shirt pressed, ribbons aligned. Shoes shined until the leather held the room like a dark mirror. My mother left a thermos by the door, and my father carried my bag to the car. No one said be careful. We said see you soon and meant it. The flight into Washington was smooth and forgettable. I stared out the window at the quilt of fields and suburbs and thought about how many stories were drifting beneath us at any moment. At Reagan, I kept my head down and moved through the terminal with the quiet familiarity of travel. A rideshare took me to a small hotel near the mall. I checked in under my own name because hiding would have been cowardice and also pointless. That night I ironed again, even though the fabric did not need it, and set an alarm I would not need. Morning came clean and early. The air in September held a trace of summer without the weight. I walked to the building past joggers and tourists who did not look up. Security was polite and thorough. I handed over my phone and followed a civilian liaison through corridors lined with framed photographs of aircraft and units from decades of service. The conference room was larger than expected and emptier. A pitcher of water, name placards, a screen that announced a date and a case number. The flag in the corner made the space feel like a promise. Tyler Brooks arrived right on time and took the chair beside me. He was younger than most JAG attorneys I had dealt with and carried himself with a precise steadiness that would have fit on a flight deck. He reviewed the outline one last time. He reminded me to stick to the facts and to avoid arguing with hypotheticals. He said no spin and no excuses, and that the record already carried more weight than any adjective. I nodded and let the words settle where I could reach them if my heart began to run. The board filed in without ceremony. A senior colonel with a face like an old map. 2 field-grade officers who looked like they still ran before dawn. A civilian member with a tablet and an efficient smile. The chair opened the session with the cadence of someone who had done this many times. Tyler introduced me for the record. Then it was my turn. I began where the mission had begun. Kandahar. Night operations. A recon team moving through a corridor that had been quiet on imagery and then was not. I described the weather as I remembered it and the communications load on the net. I stated fuel numbers and ordnance load and the range to the nearest divert field. I kept my voice level and my answers short. The questions came clean and technical at first. At what point did I recognize that the ground element had lost freedom of maneuver? At what point did the variables shift from routine to urgent? What information did I have that shaped the choice to descend? What information did I lack? When they asked why I stayed after the first pass, when the board believed I had fuel to return, I answered with the sentence that had lived inside me since that night. Because I heard them calling for help. Because you do not leave people behind. I did not look at the recorder while I said it. I looked at the table and held the memory like a small, bright thing that still lit the dark when I needed it. The questions moved to doctrine and deconfliction, and whether I believed I had exceeded my authority. I said I believed I had used the authority inherent in command intent to protect friendly forces when the plan failed on contact. The chair asked whether I had considered that my loss would have compounded the risk to the force. I said I had considered it every second and had flown to reduce that risk while buying the time the helicopters needed. There was a long pause in which I could hear air moving behind the vents. They asked about reports that suggested procedural lapses in other areas of my career. I asked for clarification, and they cited articles that did not name sources. Tyler objected to the relevance, and the chair sustained with a crisp nod. The civilian member asked whether I had knowledge of any unauthorized access of avionics data by acquaintances or family members. I said no. The board moved on without color. When my portion ended, the chair thanked me and asked me to step outside while they called the next witness. The door closed with a muted click. Tyler exhaled and slid a cup of water toward me. He said I had done exactly what I needed to do. He said we would know more by afternoon. Ethan arrived in the hallway, carrying the tired posture of a man who had not slept. He wore a dark suit that sat oddly on a frame, built for different uniforms. He greeted me with a small nod and no words. We sat in silence until the liaison opened the door and called his name. He stood and paused, then leaned close enough that I could hear him without anyone else hearing. He said he would not fail me again. He went in before I could answer. Time in bureaucratic hallways runs in a different direction. Seconds slide long, and minutes vanish. I watch the pattern of the carpet and the shadow of the flag against the glass. I thought of my father at our kitchen table, sorting papers into stacks that calmed his hands. I thought of my mother with her glasses pushed into her hair, making too much food because feeding people is the one reliable lever she has. The door opened at last, and a staffer called me back in. Ethan stood near the table, face steady, hands loose at his sides like he had remembered how to stand at ease. The chair asked him to confirm his identity and service. Then the question that changed the weight in the room landed as softly as a pebble. Who was the pilot who supported your team in the Arghandab corridor on the night in question? Ethan looked at the board and then at me and then back at the board. He said that the pilot was an Air Force captain named Lauren Mitchell. He said that she had flown lower than Angel's Guard and had turned a death road into a way out. He said that he had kept her identity to himself because the mission had been sealed and because men had not all come home from other nights, and he had learned to keep what he could from the noise. He said that he understood that silence can become complicity when the wrong stories begin to win. The room did not react. There was only the faint scratch of a pen as the civilian member took a note. The chair asked whether he had documentation. Ethan reached into a folder and produced a page in neat block print. He said it was a letter from Lieutenant Commander Mark Barnes, signed and dated, recounting the events of that night as seen from the ground. The letter did not romanticize what had happened. It described positions and fire and the way the air support had held until the second helicopter cleared weight and lifted. It ended with one line that made my throat tighten. We walked because she refused to leave us on our knees. The board accepted the letter into the record. They asked Ethan a final series of procedural questions and then dismissed him. He stepped back and the chair turned to me. Did I have anything to add? I said only that I had done my job. The chair held my gaze for a breath and then thanked me again. The session recessed. Outside the building, the day had brightened to a clear blue that felt almost offensive. Rachel waited near the bottom of the steps with a notebook and a press badge tucked into her jacket. She raised a hand without stepping into my path. She said she would keep this brief. She said she had sat through the hearing and that she understood more now. She said she had thought I was a public relations fabrication and that she was wrong. She said she would be writing a correction. I told her I appreciated accuracy. She said she wished the word sorry worked the way people hoped it would. I said, sorry rarely fixes anything by itself. I walked on and she did not follow. Tyler caught up with me at the curb and said the board would confer and that we would receive formal notice soon. He advised me to stay off television and to avoid statements beyond the sentence we had already agreed upon. He added that he believed the process had gone as well as it could. I thanked him and shook his hand. It felt good to do something simple and old-fashioned. I took a long walk along the mall to bleed the adrenaline edge. School groups moved in clusters. A couple shared a bench with a paper bag lunch between them. A jogger stopped to retie a shoe. Life was spectacularly indifferent to the upheaval inside my chest, and I found that comforting. I called my mother and told her that the hearing was complete and that I was coming home that night. She asked no questions and only said that she would have dinner waiting if I arrived before 10. My father came on the line and said a single word that meant proud and careful and solid all at once. At the hotel, I changed into jeans and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, staring at the wall as the hum of the air unit filled the pauses. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan that said simply, "Thank you." I wrote back that he did not owe me that, and he replied that some debts are not about owing. I put the phone down and closed my eyes and let the quiet take me under for a few minutes. The flight home was later and full. I sat between a man who slept and a woman who graded papers with a red pen. She asked where I was headed, and I said home. She said that was the only answer that made air travel bearable. The plane dipped once, adjusted, and settled. Through the window, the city lights stitched themselves into patterns that looked from up here like certainty. When I landed in Asheville, the air smelled like rain on brick. My father waited at the curb and waved like he had when I was a kid. In the car, he asked if I wanted the radio on. I said no. We drove in the quiet that takes two people to build. At the house, my mother kissed my cheek and set a plate on the table without asking if I was hungry. I ate because that was part of the ritual. Later, I stood in the backyard where the cooler ring still marked the concrete from the holiday. The night was deep and clear, and the crickets were loud. I thought about what had been said in that room and what had not. I thought about names written into a record that mattered, and the ones shouted into comment sections that did not. I felt the first small shift inside a place that had been locked for too long. Then I went inside and turned off the porch light and let the door click shut behind me. Chapter 5. The second barbecue autumn settled in fast that year, the sugar maples along the street turning the color of embers, and the air carrying that dry rustle that means the season has changed. A group text arrived from Susan Cole with a cheerful note about getting together at their place on Saturday. She wrote that it would be nice to have everyone under one roof again and that Ethan would be grilling. My mother pressed her lips together as she read it and then set her phone down, as if the message weighed more than it should. She asked if I felt up to going. I said yes, because avoiding family is another kind of fight, and I was tired of fighting shadows. The afternoon was cool and bright when we pulled into their driveway. The Cole house is all warm brick and big windows, a porch swing that creaks in a friendly way, a yard that looks like it belongs in a magazine around Thanksgiving. Music came from a speaker, set near the steps. College football murmured from a television inside. The smell of smoke and rosemary drifted from the grill. A folding table had been set under the carport, laid out with casseroles in church pans and a bowl of apples that looked too perfect to eat. I recognized half the neighbors, and the rest recognized me, in that way where they tried not to stare and stared anyway. Jake saw us come up the walk and lifted a hand that tried to say casual ease. He wore a fitted sweater and expensive sneakers, and the fixed grin of someone who has rehearsed being fine. The investigation into his training venture had become public in small, embarrassing ways. Sponsors had gone quiet. A few clients had demanded refunds. He had posted a long message online about values and lessons learned, and then deleted it. Now he was here, smiling. He stepped close enough that I could hear him without anyone else hearing, and said that he was glad we made it. Then he turned toward the crowd and raised his voice. "Glad you made it, Valkyrie. Just do not buzz the house with your jet this time, okay?" A couple of people gave the kind of chuckle you offer a child after you have asked him twice to use his inside voice. I gave him the quiet smile I save for people who want to score points and are not sure how the game is played. Ethan stood at the grill in a navy sweater and an apron that said, Kiss the cook in faded letters. He had the kind of calm only a few men carry, something built from long nights and hard choices. When he looked at me, there was a question in his eyes, and then a nod. My father shook his hand, and they spoke about nothing for a moment, the way men do when they have already said the important thing and now want to show their hands are empty of harm. Inside, the house smelled like cedar and starch, and the kind of floor wax that means people care about what they have. The mantel held photos that covered 3 decades, Ethan in desert tan, with a team behind him squinting against hard light. Susan in a summer dress holding a baby with Jake's eyes. Jake as a teenager, with a football tucked into his arm, jaw set like the world had already promised him something. In one frame, Jake and me as kids, sitting on the curb at a parade, tiny flags in our hands, faces lifted to a sky that had not yet broken either of us open. I helped Susan bring out plates. She chattered about the farmer's market and a neighbor's new puppy, and a recipe she wanted me to try. The words were a bridge she was building as fast as she could. I walked back outside with a stack of cups and saw a man from 2 doors down, standing near the cooler. He had been at the 4th of July party and had offered me lawn chairs for the fireworks and had later written a kind note after one of the articles. He lifted his can slightly and asked how the city had been. I said the hearing went as hearings go and that I was glad to be home. He nodded, and then he did what people do when they want to participate without overstepping. He asked what my call sign was. Valkyrie? I said, it is a small thing to say a single word. It is a larger thing to allow it to carry the weight it carries. The sound of plates dimmed, the football game dropped to a whisper as someone turned the volume down. Conversation slowed, like the whole backyard had remembered a meeting it needed to make on time. Ethan set his drink on the rail. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said that I was the pilot who saved his team in Kandahar in 2015. He said it the way you say your own name when you finally decide to claim it. The hush that followed was not empty. It was full of the math people do when a new piece drops into the middle of a picture and changes what all the other pieces mean. I watched faces arrange themselves into something like understanding. Jake stood very still, with a plastic cup in his hand. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He looked at his father, then at me, then away. I did not know, he said. It came out thin. Ethan's tone did not harden as much as it settled. Not knowing does not give you the right to tear someone down, he said. You own what you say. Even when you are ignorant, no one filled the pause with nervous chatter. Susan blinked fast and lifted a hand to her mouth. My father let out a breath. I did not know he had been holding, and a smile tugged at his face. A small thing that felt like a door opening in a room that has been closed too long. My mother brushed at her eye and looked at me like she could finally place where to set the pride she had been carrying. A neighbor cleared his throat and asked if he could help carry the salads. He had the good sense to move the moment along without disrespecting it. The party found a new rhythm, quieter and somehow warmer. People asked me normal questions. What do you think of the traffic lights they added near the park? Is Nevada as dry as they say? Do you still like sweet tea? Or did the Air Force cure you of that? I answered about traffic and weather and tea, and let the mundane do its work. The extraordinary had already been said. Jake came over after a while and stood beside me near the steps where the late sun caught dust in the air. He looked different without the mask of his brand, smaller. He said he had been stupid. He said he had been scared. He said he had not realized how much noise he was making or who it was drowning out. I listened. He offered a hand like a truce. I did not take it, not yet. I told him that some debts are paid with time, not gestures. He nodded and swallowed and said he would try to make it right. I told him the first thing he could do was let the day be about more than him. Ethan called everyone to eat and handed me the first plate off the grill without ceremony. The neighbors formed a line that somehow avoided the awkwardness of who should go first. Kids darted under elbows to grab rolls. Someone passed a jar of pickles and a half-dozen paper napkins. For a while, the sounds were all pleasant and ordinary. Forks against plates, low conversation, the light breeze that kept blowing the paper tablecloth up at the corners. A man from down the street, a veteran with kind eyes who had kept his record to himself for years, pulled me aside by the garage. He said he had been on the other end of a radio more than once, praying for a sound above him that meant he was not alone. He said that whatever the news said, the people who understood would always understand. I thanked him and meant it. Inside, I caught a glimpse of the football game, replaying a catch in slow motion, the receiver dragging a toe inside the line, the announcer's voice thick with awe. It struck me that so much of what we call heroism is timing, and eyes trained to see the details that the rest of the world misses until someone circles them with a marker. As dusk settled, someone lit the string lights under the eaves. The bulbs washed everything in a soft gold that made even the hard edges look tender. I stood by the fence and watched my father talk with Ethan about fishing in a creek they both loved as boys. Susan pressed a small plate of brownies into my mother's hands and told her she had made them just for her. Jake collected empty plates and carried them to the kitchen without being asked. He moved with care, as if balance could become a practice. A neighbor raised a question about a charity run the following month and whether the family would field a team. Ethan said yes immediately and looked to me. I said I would run if I was in town. He smiled a small, real smile and said that would be good. The evening thinned the way evenings do in October, with people leaving in pairs, hands tucked in jackets, promises to get together again soon. The yard emptied in stages, laughter softened as goodbyes reached the sidewalk. When the last guest left, the lights seemed brighter for a minute, then ordinary again. I sat on the porch step while Ethan took off the apron and set the grill to cool. He came over and handed me a bottle of water, and we watched the steam lift from the grates. He said thank you in a voice that belonged to only us. I said for what? He said for letting the truth land without needing to crush anyone with it. He said it is a rare thing. Restraint, he said it is harder than force. My parents came out onto the porch. My father had that faint smile still, the one that made him look younger. My mother leaned against the rail, her hand close to mine without touching. None of us said much. We did not have to. The air felt different. It was still and heavy in the way of full rooms, after the guests have gone, but the heaviness was not dread anymore. It was respect settling into a place it should have been all along. A car door thumped softly across the street. A dog barked once and then quieted. The smell of smoke lingered with the sweetness of baked apples cooling somewhere inside. Jake came out with a trash bag, tied it, and carried it to the bin at the curb. He paused, looked over, opened his mouth, closed it, and lifted a hand. I lifted mine in return. Not a full truce, not yet. But what passes for one on a fall evening in a town that still remembers your name from classroom roll call and church bulletins? When it was time to go, Ethan walked us to the car. He said we should drive safe. He did not add anything clever or heavy. He squeezed my shoulder once, the way commanders do when they want to say a dozen things at once and decide that one human gesture will hold them all. In the quiet of my parents' car, with the window cracked to let in the cold, I watched the coal house recede in the rear view as the porch light drew a soft circle on the lawn. The truth had been spoken out loud, and like all true things, it did not need to be repeated to matter. The night felt clean. I rested my head against the seat and let the city lights slip past, ready for whatever would come when morning returned. Chapter 6. Consequences. The days after the barbecue stretched into weeks, but the quiet that followed wasn't really quiet. The fallout came slowly, like a storm that you see gathering on the horizon, but can't fully understand until it's already breaking over your head. The Air Force's statement was simple. My name was cleared. I was fully exonerated for any alleged procedural missteps during the Kandahar mission. I had acted within my authority, and the records would show that my actions were not just justified but commendable. The retraction Rachel Nyan posted didn't carry the weight of an apology, but it didn't need to. Valkyrie, the pilot who never left anyone behind, the headline read. She didn't write much more than that, but it was enough. It wasn't just the facts, it was the truth now, out loud for anyone who cared to listen. At home, I let the relief settle in my bones like a good night's sleep. The storm had passed. There were no more calls from reporters, no more strange emails from people who thought they knew me, no more anonymous comments questioning my integrity. I didn't feel victorious. It wasn't about that anymore. I had done my job, and now I could rest easy knowing I'd been seen for what I was. But Jake's world didn't settle like mine did. If anything, it collapsed around him. The first rumors trickled in quietly. There was something wrong with his business. A few training clients had started asking questions. Then it hit the news. Jake's Seal Fit Challenge was exposed as a scam. There were no credentials. The certifications he had sold to his clients were faked, and some of his promotional material, the stuff he'd used to rope in followers, had borrowed far too much from his father's reputation. A number $250,000 surfaced, the amount Jake owed in refunds to clients who had trusted him. Social media lit up with angry posts. The followers who had once cheered for him turned their backs, unfollowing in droves, leaving only a few devoted diehards behind. His brand, which he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling faster than a sandcastle at high tide. The media wasn't kind. News outlets started running the story as "the son who faked valor." It was a headline that stuck, spreading like wildfire. People in the comments didn't care about context. They didn't care that Jake was young or that he had made a mistake. All they saw was the son of a Navy SEAL, a man who had built his whole identity on proximity to his father's name, trying to cash in on that legacy without ever earning it. Ethan didn't defend him. Not publicly, not privately. I heard his voice for the first time in a long while late one night while I was sitting on the porch at my parents' house, trying to drink my tea before it got cold. He had called to check in, like he often did, but this time there was a heaviness in his voice. "Lauren," he said, his voice clipped. Jake wanted respect. There was a pause before he added, "I told him, earn it with honesty." There was no anger in Ethan's words, just a quiet resignation. He wasn't disappointed. He was done. The kind of done that comes after years of watching someone you love make mistakes, all while knowing they could do better but choosing not to. I didn't say much back, just let the silence hang for a moment before I thanked him. A few days later, Jake showed up at my door. He looked tired. His eyes were hollow in a way I hadn't seen before, his usual bravado replaced with exhaustion. He was dressed in a hoodie and jeans, looking smaller than I remembered. For the first time, I didn't see him as the guy who liked to joke about being the tough one, the one who lived off the military culture without really living it. I saw someone who had fallen off the pedestal he'd spent so long building for himself. "I wasn't jealous because you were brave," he said quietly, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I was scared because I'll never be that kind of person." His words hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't just apologizing for the things he had said in the past. He was admitting something deeper, something that had been eating away at him for years. He had lived in the shadow of his father's legacy and had always thought he had to outdo it, to earn respect the only way he knew how, by performing. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the sting of years of mockery. I just felt tired. "You don't need to wear a uniform to live with honor," I said, my voice calm, steady. "Just do the right thing, even when no one's watching." I wasn't angry at him anymore. In fact, I felt something close to pity, but not in the way I would have thought. Pity for the man who had spent so long trying to outrun a shadow, when all he needed to do was step into the light of his own choices. I saw his expression shift, the weight of my words finally hitting him, the truth sitting between us, unspoken but understood. For the first time in years, Jake didn't argue. He didn't try to excuse his behavior or justify his actions. He just nodded, a quiet acceptance in his eyes. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt like the first step toward change. He didn't speak another word. He didn't need to. The next few days felt different. I saw Jake in passing, but he never said much. There was no performance, no bravado. He helped out more around the house, made small talk with the neighbors, and at the family dinner a week later, he wasn't the center of attention anymore. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He didn't make jokes at my expense. He was simply there, quieter, more measured. I noticed that even my parents seemed to breathe a little easier around him, not because they had forgiven him, but because they could see the shift in him too. He wasn't trying to be someone else anymore. It wasn't an apology, not a full one anyway. But it was a change, a beginning. Jake's financial troubles didn't magically disappear, but for the first time, he began to take responsibility. His social media presence faded. He stopped trying to sell himself as a military expert and focused on rebuilding his reputation from the ground up. He found a real job in a local gym, helping people train for certifications that had actual value. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The family didn't immediately forget everything, but the distance between us started to shrink. There were still awkward moments, still that unresolved tension that had built up for years, but it was manageable now. I stopped carrying the weight of every word that had been said. One night, not long after Jake had started his shift in the right direction, my father and I sat on the porch, just watching the stars through the oak trees. He didn't talk much, he rarely did, but every now and then, his hand would rest on my shoulder, and I would feel the weight of years of quiet pride in the gesture. "You did good, kid," he said one night. "You did real good." I smiled and let the words settle around me like comfort. The storm had passed. It wasn't over, but it had moved on. For the first time in a long while, things felt like they were in the right place. Jake had found his way, and for the first time, he wasn't looking to me for validation. He was simply living it, and that, more than anything else, made all the difference. The next few months would bring their own set of challenges. There would still be bumps, but for now, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes from truth spoken quietly, from change that's earned instead of given, and I was ready for whatever came next, even if it wasn't what I expected. Chapter 7: Redemption and Legacy. The spring of 2024 arrived like a breath I had been holding for far too long. The weather in Nevada was a different kind of heat than I was used to: dry, pressing, and always relentless. I had been stationed at Nellis Air Force Base for a year now, and life had fallen into a new rhythm. The base was large, sprawling, with the buzz of activity that I had grown to appreciate. I was officially commanding the 63rd Attack Squadron, one of the busiest in the Air Force, responsible for 10 Warthog operations. It was the kind of job that left no room for doubt. There was always something to manage, something to fix, something to plan. It had been an exhausting few months. Leading 60 pilots and a team of support personnel was no small task. The responsibility had settled onto my shoulders in a way that felt natural, but the weight was always there. I found a strange comfort in the chaos, in the constant need to make decisions that impacted people's lives. This was the life I had fought for, the life I had worked for since that first day I stepped into flight school. But it wasn't all business. There were moments when I would find myself reflecting on the journey that had gotten me here, the sacrifices, the people I had lost along the way, and the ones who had stuck around. Jake had started working with the Veteran Transition Network, helping soldiers reintegrate into civilian life. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. The irony wasn't lost on me, though. He had spent so long pretending to be something he wasn't, fighting for a reputation that wasn't his own, and now, in his own way, he was finally doing something real. It was Memorial Day weekend when I saw him and Ethan again, this time at a ceremony hosted by the Veterans Affairs office in town. I had been invited to speak briefly, to give a nod to the veterans who had come before us, and to honor the fallen. The ceremony was simple. A few hundred people gathered under tents with flags and speeches, the smell of grilling burgers hanging in the air. Ethan was standing near the back, a familiar, solid figure in his crisp navy suit. Jake was with him, his hand around the shoulder of his young son. Henry, now 4, looked up at me with wide eyes as he tugged on his father's pant leg. Jake leaned down and whispered something to him. The little boy stood on his tiptoes and asked, in a voice louder than necessary, "Is she really Valkyrie?" Jake straightened and nodded, his expression softening. "She's the one who saved Grandpa," he said, and there was a weight to the words that I hadn't expected. Henry's face lit up, and he ran toward me, a tiny salute raised high, the palm of his hand not quite straight, but the gesture full of sincerity. "Thank you for keeping everyone safe," he said, his voice ringing clear across the yard. I bent down to meet him at eye level, my own salute returning as natural as breathing. I straightened up, and I saw Ethan watching me from the other side of the yard. His eyes glistened, and for the first time, I saw something in him that wasn't just duty, but deep, unspoken pride. It was a small moment, but one that felt like a quiet bridge had been built between us. After the ceremony, Ethan came over to me. He handed me an envelope, sealed with the kind of care that only comes when something is important. I looked at him, puzzled, and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, typed neatly but with a handwritten note at the end. It was from Lieutenant Commander Mark Barnes, one of Ethan's former SEAL teammates. The letter thanked me, in the simplest, most profound way, for the actions I had taken on that night in the canyon. "Because of you, we got to come home," it said. "We got to raise our kids to respect people like you." I read the words slowly, feeling the weight of them. I didn't know how to react at first. There was no medal, no public recognition, but in that moment, I realized this was all I ever needed. The people who truly understood what I had done had always known. They had always respected me in a way that didn't require anyone else to understand. I folded the letter carefully and looked up at Ethan. He smiled, just a slight curve of his lips, and I could feel the unspoken connection between us, the years of distance, the silent judgments, all the things left unsaid. They were not erased, but they were acknowledged. That small moment with Henry, that simple gesture, had changed the weight of everything. Jake approached us then, his steps hesitant but steady. He looked different, less like the confident, brash man I had once known, and more like someone who had been through something and had come out the other side. His eyes were tired, the kind of exhaustion you get when you've been fighting a war inside yourself for too long. He stopped in front of me and just looked at me for a moment. "I didn't get it," he said quietly. "Not before, not really. I didn't say anything. I just let the silence sit between us, thick with years of missteps and misunderstandings. I was scared," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared that I'd never be enough, scared that I'd never measure up to Dad or to you. I thought if I played the part, maybe I could make people believe I was just as tough, but I wasn't, and I couldn't fake it anymore." His words felt like a weight lifting from his chest. I didn't need to respond right away. For the first time in my life, I felt like Jake wasn't asking for my validation. He wasn't looking for me to forgive him or make him feel better. He was just saying the truth, and for the first time, I could see that he was starting to understand what respect really was. "You don't need to wear a uniform to live with honor," I said softly. "You don't need anyone's approval to do the right thing. You just do it, even when no one's watching." Jake's face twitched slightly, like he was fighting something back, but he didn't speak. He didn't try to explain himself. He just nodded, his shoulders a little lower than they had been before, the air between us a little lighter. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was a shift, a beginning, a new understanding, even if it was still fragile and unspoken. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet ease that felt new. People moved around the yard, catching up, talking about the next big thing, and I found myself standing back, watching it all unfold. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like an outsider. I didn't feel like the one who had to prove anything. I was just Lauren, the pilot who had done her job, and in some small way, had helped make things right. As the evening wore on, the air cooled and the lights dimmed, and eventually the crowd began to thin. People said their goodbyes, packed up leftovers, and left. Jake and his family stayed longer than anyone else, sitting quietly on the porch as the last of the light faded from the sky. When I finally stood up to leave, Jake stood with me. There was a heaviness still in his eyes, but it wasn't the same weight as before. He wasn't carrying the mask of bravado anymore. He was simply here, trying to do better, trying to understand what it meant to really honor the legacy of his father, not by pretending, but by being honest. He gave me a brief nod, his hand hanging at his side like he wasn't sure what to say. I didn't expect him to say anything more. I just nodded back, feeling something in the air shift again. Ethan walked me to my car, a quiet presence at my side. He didn't say much, but the pride in his eyes was enough. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of the past between us. The past had been acknowledged, but it no longer defined us. When I got into my car, I started the engine and glanced back at the house one last time. The lights were dim, but I knew the shift that had begun that evening was only the start. There would be more work to do, more understanding to gain, but for the first time, the road ahead felt less like a battle and more like a chance to move forward. I drove away slowly, the night air cool against my skin, ready for whatever the next step would bring. Chapter 8. Truth, Justice, and Peace. The morning of the ceremony felt surreal. The base was quieter than usual, the hum of everyday activity swallowed by the weight of what was happening. It was summer 2024, and the heat over Nevada had already begun to bake the tarmac as I made my way to the stage, set up near the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base. The sun blazed down, but there was a breeze that shifted just enough to make it bearable. The stage was simple, flanked by a few American flags, a podium, and a backdrop with the seal of the Air Force. The crowd was a mix of military personnel, veterans, and family. Among the crowd, I saw my parents standing together near the front. My father, usually a man of few words, had his hand firmly in my mother's. Her eyes were bright, but I knew they were tired from the last few months. Ethan stood off to the side, his arms crossed, but I could tell by the slight lift in his posture that he was proud. Jake and Henry stood beside him, waving from the crowd. Jake's face looked different, less guarded than I had ever seen it. Henry was small, waving eagerly, his eyes wide with curiosity. For a brief moment, the weight of the years, of everything I had carried, seemed to lighten. The ceremony began. The Secretary of the Air Force spoke briefly, but the words felt like a blur as I stepped forward. My heart was pounding, but I didn't let it show. I had prepared for this moment in silence for so long, but now that I was standing there, I realized I hadn't quite expected it to feel like this. I had earned this. I had earned the right to stand here, to wear this medal, and to be seen for what I was. As the secretary placed the silver oak leaf on my chest, I stood still, feeling the weight of the honor, but also the weight of the journey it had taken to get here. It wasn't about the medal. It wasn't about the title. It was about everything that led to this moment. Every mission, every sacrifice, every moment I had pushed myself past the limit. I gave my short speech, my voice clear but steady. Not every battle ends with victory. Some end when you no longer need to prove yourself. I didn't need revenge. I just let the truth speak for itself. The words hung in the air for a moment, their simplicity grounding me. As I spoke, the sunlight hit the metal of my metal, making it gleam, and I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I had finally been seen, not just for my role in the Air Force, but for everything I was, the woman who had spent years doing her job, not for recognition, but for the people she protected. The crowd applauded, but the noise faded as I turned to look at my family. My father's smile was proud, but soft, as though he had finally understood what I had always wanted him to. My mother's eyes were moist, but there was no sadness in them, just an overwhelming sense of relief and pride. Ethan stood off to the side, his expression unreadable, but his posture relaxed, as if the weight of the past few months had finally been lifted. Jake looked at me from the crowd, his eyes steady, and he gave a slight nod. He didn't need to say anything. His apology had already been made, and we both knew that this moment was about something bigger than either of us. As I stood there, I thought about the years that had led me here, the missions, the struggles, the sacrifices I had made, and the ones I had yet to make. But there was also something else that had been growing inside me over the past few months, a quiet acceptance. The truth had come out. I didn't need to fight for respect anymore. It had been earned through years of silent work and steadfast commitment. The applause slowly died down as I stepped back from the podium. Ethan came forward first, his hand outstretched. "I knew you would get here," he said simply. There was no need for anything more. We both knew what had been unsaid for so long, and now it didn't matter. We were just two people who had weathered a storm and come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger for it. Jake followed, his face slightly flushed, but the tension was gone from his posture. "You deserved this," he said quietly, and there was no irony, no performance in his voice. "I know that now." Henry tugged at his father's hand and came running up to me. "Thank you for keeping everyone safe," he said again, his small voice clear and certain. I crouched down to his level, returning the salute he had given me so earnestly before. I smiled at him, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't expected. "You're welcome, little man," I said softly, and I stood up just as Ethan put a hand on my shoulder. For a moment we all stood there together, letting the quiet of the evening settle around us. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over everything. It was as if the ceremony had ended, and now the real work began, the work of rebuilding, of finding peace, of understanding each other in ways we hadn't before. Ethan pulled me aside later, a small smile on his face. He handed me an envelope, this one different from the letter from Barnes that I had received in the past. I opened it carefully, and inside was a handwritten note, the kind that you keep for yourself when words are too much. "Because of you," it read, "we got to come home. We got to raise our kids to respect people like you." It was from another one of Ethan's former SEAL teammates, a man I had never met, but one who had been saved that night in Kandahar. I folded the letter carefully, holding it to my chest for a moment before looking up at Ethan. He gave me a quiet, understanding nod. "You earned this," he said softly. The weight of the words settled around me, not in a heavy way, but in the kind of way that feels like a full circle. The years of silence, the years of misunderstanding, had finally come to an end. I had been seen for who I was, not just as a daughter, a cousin, or a pilot, but as someone who had done her job when no one else could. Jake and I had come a long way. His path hadn't been easy, and neither had mine, but we had both learned that respect was something you earned, not something you demanded. I had learned that lesson long ago, and in that moment, I realized that the people who mattered, the ones who truly understood, had always seen me for who I was. The rest of the world would catch up eventually. As the night grew darker and the stars above Nellis Air Force Base began to shine, I stood with my family, knowing that I had earned my place, not just in the Air Force, but in their hearts. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment and let me know how you've overcome being underestimated. How have you claimed your own respect? And what did it take to finally be seen? Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear that they are enough, just as they are. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of strength and perseverance.